On this episode, we cover 2 February 2007 episodes of the Penn Jillette Radio Show, in which Joe Rogan debated astronomer Phil Plait about the moon landing. No Rogan Experience starts right now. Welcome back to the show. This is a show where two podcasters, now with 201 hours of Rogan experience, get to know Joe Rogan. It's a show for those who are curious about Joe Rogan, his guests, and their claims, as well as for anyone who wants to understand Joe's ever-growing media influence. I'm Cecil Cicirello. That's Michael Marshall. Today, we're going to be covering Joe's 2007 moon landing debate with astronomer Phil Plait on the Penn Jillette Radio Show. Marsh, how did this debate come about?
So in 2002, Penn and Teller were on Fear Factor, where Penn met with the host, which was a young comedian by the name of Joe Rogan. And to hear Penn tell it, and we will hear Penn tell it a bit, they just hit it off right away. They were really simpatico, great friends immediately, getting on famously up until the moment that Joe told Penn that the moon landing never happened. And this apparently blew Penn's mind, and he couldn't believe that this guy who agreed with him on so much stuff didn't agree about something as fundamental as whether the moon landing took place. Fast forward a few years, Penn's got this live weekly radio show, and he's hanging around the skeptics movement too. He regularly went to the Amazing Meeting and things like that. And he was friends with the bad astronomer Phil Plait, who wrote for Slate and wrote for multiple other places too. So as a result, Penn sets up this conversation between Joe Rogan and someone who actually knows what they're talking about when it comes to the moon landing.
So why exactly are we covering this?
So there's a couple of reasons, really. So first of all, this was literally my first ever exposure to Joe Rogan. I had never heard of Joe Rogan before I heard this conversation. I used to listen to Penn's radio show as a podcast from time to time. And because I've been listening for a while, I went through the back catalog and I saw that this conversation was in here. There was 2 different conversations, both in February, one from the start of February and then one from like 3 weeks later in February 2007. And I figured it would be really interesting for us to listen to this 2-part debate in the context of modern Joe Rogan. Because Joe, on these conversations, doesn't believe the moon landing happens, and Joe today no longer believes that the moon landing was faked. Although, there's kind of an asterisk on that, because we have seen him slip like very comfortably into recounting the arguments that were for moonland denial in some of the shows that we've seen. Like, he is at least still excited about the idea that it was faked, even if he isn't persuaded that it really was faked. He certainly isn't persuaded that all of the anomalies he used to be able to spot have been accounted for by kind of good scientific arguments. So I think overall, he'd put his chip down on it happened, but he's not 100% about all of the details here. So I thought it'd be a really interesting exercise to compare the Joe that we hear here in this conversation with the Joe that we've been listening to almost 20 years later. And it'll help us see how much has he changed, and also to what degree is he still the same person, just with different preoccupations and different topics now.
All right. Well, our main event this week is going to be how Joe argues that the moon landing was faked. But before we get to that, we want to say thanks to our Area 51 All Access Pass patrons. That's Chunky Cat in Chicago, has the catnip ready for when the cholesterol does its job. Fuck Donald John Trump. Scott Laird, Stone Banana, Laura Williams, no, not that one, the other one, Ram's Ham Tickler, it's oregano, it's definitely oregano, Megan Bray, don't thank me, your show is just worth investment, Matthew Cutler, autistic Twitch streamer, Fred Arguthius, Morgan Gordon, billionaire oligarchs, Darlene, help me know Rogan Kenobi, you're my only podcast now that Knowledge Fight is gone, who will warn me of the sex robots, Angie Madkey, Lucy Cortez, Left Hand Voodoo, Dr. Andrew Gibson, online physics tutor, Stargazer 97, Cindy Lynch, yes, that's Cindy Lynch, and Carissa Gunderson. They all subscribe to patreon.com/NoRogan. You can do that as well. All patrons get early access to ad-free episodes and a special patron-only bonus segment every single week. And this week, we're going to find out just how much Penn loves Joe. Spoiler, it's a lot. It's a whole lot. Check it out. Check it out at patreon.com/NoRogan. But for now, our main event.
It's time, y'all.
Huge thank you to this week's veteran voice of the podcast. That was Alfred from the Blue Ridge True Crime Podcast, keeping history alive one crime at a time, announcing our main event. Remember that you too can be on the show by sending us a recording of you, giving us your best rendition of It's Time. You can send that to NoRoganPod@gmail.com, as well as how you'd like to be credited on the show. So this is 2 episodes. We'll be listening to the first one, and the audio quality for Joe is low on this one because Joe is calling in and Phil is in studio. This sets it up right at the beginning, and this is the one that happened early on in February.
Yeah, this is Penn Jillette on the big CBS Radio Freak FM. I'm sitting here with Michael Godot, and this is a very special show. This is a show I've been waiting to do since before I had a show. Before there was time to have a show, I did Fear Factor years ago. Tell and I did it. And the host is Joe Rogan, and we got along fabulously. I had such a crush on him. I just dug him. We're sitting around afterwards talking, and we're agreeing on everything. I mean, we're just going through the whole list, man. Atheist, this is BS, this is BS. Boom, boom, boom. It's just this huge kind of bonding experience. Fast, funny, cool. Went to see him live. He's terrific. And then Joe says, kind of out of the blue, and of course you don't believe we landed on the moon. And I, of course, say, you mean you and me, Joe? Or do you mean humanity? And Joe says, oh, no, humanity. We didn't land. It's impossible. And then starts a relationship between me and Joe where we are getting along and loving each other. And then he sends me these videotapes that are done by mentally ill people that say absolute nonsense. So I told him, one of these days, I'm going to get you with someone who can really discuss this with you. So I have here in the studio the bad astronomer, not the bad astronomer,
sure.
Phil Plait, and he has dealt with the moon landing, and the word lunatic comes up very often because of its roots. So, Joe, are you there?
Yes.
Joe is here. Phil is here. Joe, you tell us how we didn't land on the moon, and Phil will explain it back to you, okay? I also want to say before you get going, Joe, that almost every sort of debate they ever do, like Larry King or something, they have the guy whose side the host is on is always someone with a lot of experience, and the audience is on his side, and then the guy they call in who they disagree with is some like putz who can't talk or can't do anything. We have on here someone who does like ultimate fighting, someone who is in stand-up is terrific. So in this case, the bad guy, I believe, has more skills at talking than the good guy. This is why it's going to be so great.
Yikes.
Yeah, yikes. I mean, that is a harsh thing to say. Phil Plait is in the studio
right next
there.
to you right now.
Yeah, that is me.
Jesus, man.
But yeah, so this was my first exposure to Joe Rogan, and I just think this debate, the way Penn's framing it here, I think this is going to be an interesting exercise for us to listen to here.
Yeah, I actually used to listen to Penn's show on occasion too, and I must have missed this one. In fact, I didn't even realize that they had a debate until we started talking about it today. Or until we started working on this particular show.
And like I said, the setup is really interesting because, let's say, Phil is in the studio in Penn's house. This is the studio in Penn's house, but it's Joe that Penn gives all of the big intro to here. Like, all we hear about Phil Plait is that he's dealt with the moon landing and he has a blog, Bad Astronomy. We know nothing about the fact that he is he's got a doctorate in astrophysics and things like this. And this is an active fuck you to Phil Plait right at the start of this. And that might give us a bit of a clue as to what the invigilation of this debate is going to be like. Because I would argue that while Penn agrees with Phil, I think his heart is with Joe. His heart is with the spectacle of letting Joe carry on here.
Yeah.
And we can see how much his heart is with Joe because he's saying how great like Joe is. He's such a great comedian. He's so funny. Like either Joe in 2007 was a completely different comedian or Penn's taste in comedy isn't great. Those are the two options.
Can it be both, Marsh? Can it be both? Because I think it can't be.
Yeah, it may well be both. It's also interesting that Penn explicitly points out that Joe talks about how he agrees with Penn about being an atheist as well. So we have here on
that's
tape
interesting,
record, it wasn't that Joe was agnostic, was questioning. He's explicitly an atheist. He thought religion was stupid. That's a really interesting transition for 2 decades later to what we see. And Penn is talking about the videotapes that Joe sends him from mentally ill people. Penn is just lucky that the only videos that Joe sends him are about the moon landing denial, because they could be. It could be us. It could be his standard fare today is texting videos of people dying in explicitly graphic ways. So you've dodged a bullet, as have the people in the videos by the sounds of things.
Yeah, Joe sends you shit that's trauma you have to unpack with your therapist. Like, it's really bad. So he's lucky here. Could you imagine, though, Marsh, given somebody who's just going to spread conspiracy nonsense like a microphone and a platform, and then not push back against them? Could you imagine?
That is mean. He could say, interesting. Oh, that's really interesting. He could do that. That's pushback. What would you say to people who think that is complete nonsense? To those people, not me, obviously, but to the people out there who do think that, what would you say to them?
Oh, man. I think a lot of listeners who listen to this show probably do miss Be Reasonable. I'm just saying. So that's all I'm saying. All right.
That is fair. There's only so many hours in the day. I do a lot of recording these days.
That's very fair, too. All right. So obviously, this is the next bit of tape. We're not cutting anything. He gave Joe the keys, and Joe's just going to drive away. I just want to say, too, we're not going to cut any of his beginning piece. So he speaks for almost 3 minutes straight. I'm not cutting it. We would normally cut it and interject maybe in here. That's a little longer than a normal clip, but we feel like this particular bit here needs to be open, and we have to listen to it all in one go. So this is that clip. This is just Joe continuing on after Penn has introduced him.
Yeah, this is Joe's thesis statement, essentially.
Well, this is my take on it. I am not saying that I have any information that anybody else doesn't have. I'm not saying that I know that we didn't land on the moon. I'm not saying that I know that everyone's a liar. I'm not saying that it was a total hoax. All I'm saying is when I look at all of it, when I look at the photographic evidence, or I look at the fact that we haven't been back since 1972, when I look at the fact that no humans except the Apollo astronauts have ever gone through the Van Allen radiation belt, the fact that no one's even done a flyby around the moon since then, it seems weird to me. When I look at the press conference and I see Buzz Aldrin and Neil Armstrong and Michael Collins nervous and weird and obviously like being deceptive after they came back, I go, what is that? I look at all that stuff. When I look at the video footage that Bart Siebel character, who's clearly out of his mind, for sure. And so is that Renee guy. So are a lot of those guys. But sometimes, occasionally, someone who's clearly out of their mind has a point. If you can sift through all their BS and look at all the crap that they say and run it through a filter, every now and then they'll say something, oh, well, this guy's wrong about almost everything, but is he wrong about that? Now, when I look at that video and some of the video that Siebel has of them faking the distance between the Earth and the moon when they're shooting the moon, or the Earth rather, through a circular window in the lunar module, and they have the windows blacked out. They're pretending that it's deep space. They're saying that they're 130,000 miles out, and then you see them pull the window curtains down, or the shade, whatever they have covering up with the windows, and you see that they're actually in near-Earth orbit. That makes me curious. When I look at the photographs and I see intersecting shadows. Now, I'm no photographic expert. I don't know anything about the moon, really, except stuff that I've read on the internet. I'm no scientist. But when I see intersecting shadows that seem to show some sort of a different light source, or more than one light source, it looks odd to me. When I see that those crosshairs aren't over all the images, it looks cut and cropped to me. When I look at some of the photographs of the moon, I have this gigantic coffee table book, and it's all, a NASA book, and it's beautiful pictures of the moon and all these different photographs. Well, when I look at some of them, they look obviously fake. They look cut and cropped. And I'm not saying I know they are. I'm not saying I have any special information. But I'm an open-minded person, and when I look at it, I say, look, I know I sound like a retard. I know I sound like a crackpot. I know saying that, the Earth is hollow, there's dinosaurs inside of it, I'm sure. It's very similar to saying I don't think people landed on the moon. But you know what? I don't think people landed on the moon.
Man.
So that is Joe's position statement. That's Joe's thesis statement. You can hear how hilarious Penn finds it to see this all kind of laid out. And again, Penn Jillette thinks we landed on the moon. He just thinks it's kind of neat that this person is able to just spiel through all the stuff like this. But what we really have here in like 3 minutes of Joe talking, or 2.5 minutes of Joe talking, is just a long list of logical fallacies, some of which we've covered on our toolbox, in fact. We're just asking questions. You know, Joe is saying, look, I'm not an expert. I'm just a guy. But why haven't we been back? And why hasn't any other astronaut been through the Van Allen belt? You know, he's got all these kind of lists of questions. We're anomaly hunting. Why did the astronauts, why did they seem so off when they got back? Isn't that weird? And what's with the photographs? They seem weird. And we're doing some personal incredulity. Some of these photographs, to me, they just look fake. I just think they're fake. I'm not an expert. I don't know anything, but I think they look fake. We're doing what's known as the Galileo Gambit. You know, well, even crazy people can be onto something sometimes. So there's a lot of nuts out there who believe a lot of things that are wrong, but just because they're wrong about a lot of things doesn't mean they're wrong about everything. So maybe they're right about this one particular thing that I agree with, even though I think everything else they say is wrong and unhinged. And obviously what we're seeing here is very clearly a gish gallop, you know?
Sure.
It's one after another after another. This is the first few minutes. And even if Joe just stopped right there, how can any expert tackle all of the things that Joe just made, all the points Joe just made, all the things he just raised, without taking 5 or even 10 times as long to do that? And do you think Phil Plait's going to get 10 times as long to list each of those things without Joe coming back in with even more stuff or more questions?
Right.
No. So we're seeing classic Gish Gallop stuff here.
And isn't that Brandolini's law, the idea that it takes you way longer to actually debunk than it does to actually spout the nonsense? So Joe spouts a bunch of nonsense, and it's going to take exponentially longer for someone to come in and say, okay, Joe said this, well, this is wrong because of X, Y, and Z, and it's going to take you much longer. You might lose the audience in that time. They might have forgotten about that point, but they know how it made them feel. That's also really important. Joe packs into that 3 minutes 600 plus words. That's a lot. That's a fast. He's speaking very quickly, and he's moving from topic to topic to topic. There's like 10 different things in there. You don't have an opportunity to refute them all. And a lot of them, like you suggest, Marsh, they're all about how you feel. Everything feels a little off. Everything. He is not trying to dissuade you with any kind of facts about the case. What he's trying to do is appeal to how you feel about it. That's a great way to just sort of dismantle the audience's guard, right? It lowers their defenses. And it allows them to sort of get caught in this sort of flow of the argument rather than thinking about the real important things, which are, hey, here's a bunch of facts about why you shouldn't believe this. No, I'm going to make you feel about it. And he does a great, admittedly, excellent job by Joe with the starting salvo. I don't think any of it's factual, but if we're just talking about like debate-wise, he does a good job of calling a lot of things into question that Phil can never keep up with.
Yeah, exactly. If we're just judging this debate on the number of different points that you raised and not on whether they're true or not, then Joe is obviously doing really well here. And also notice that Joe is essentially trying to play things both ways here. You know, I'm just a regular guy. What do I know? I'm not an expert in any of this stuff, but what I do know is that the intersecting shadows on the photographs are just an alternate light source when you really deep down analyze the photos released by NASA. But I'm not an expert. Like he wants you to believe that he's an everyman who has spent a lot of time getting to grips with the extreme detail of this and can cite that detail from memory.
All right. So this is Phil Plait's response to that.
Well, you just gave there's the whole argument right there. With great power, great force, great humor, and also great humility. Okay, Phil, point by point. Well, and feel free to heckle him, Joe. Not that I have to tell you to.
Well, I think we're done. Now, I let Joe rant on for a while, so now it's my turn.
Okay.
All of the points you brought up there are the same ones that are brought up on all these websites. You see them all the time. And
for sure. I'm not original.
Yeah, and they're all wrong, every one of them. And it's a lot of them are a little bit tricky to describe, and some of them are pretty easy. Like this idea that no astronaut's been in the Van Allen belt. That's just wrong.
Okay, well, who's been in through the Van Allen belts and survived besides the Apollo astronauts?
Every single shuttle astronaut who has ever gone into space. The Van Allen belts are these regions of high radioactivity outside the Earth. It's caused by the Earth's magnetic field.
Right, but they start at 300 miles out, and don't all the shuttle trips go to 300 miles? That's it.
Nope, that's not right. There is a dip in the Van Allen belts over the South Atlantic. It's called the South Atlantic Anomaly. And the shuttle goes through this every 7 or so orbits. Hubble goes through it every 7 orbits. They have to shut it down, have to shut some of the instruments down because of the increased radiation.
So here's why Joe's Gish Gallop is so effective and so hard to deal with, because Joe gave 3 straight minutes, which then Penn topped off by praising him for how well he delivered it and how much humility he had as he delivered it, while saying, I'm not an expert, but here's an in-depth knowledge from a non-expert starting point. And then Phil starts to respond to even one single point from Joe's list. He gets 20 seconds or so into that point, and Joe jumps in on him. Well, what about through the Van Allen belt? Not just into it, but through it. And then when Phil starts to respond to that jump in, Joe jumps in on that too. Yeah, but they only go to 300 miles. They don't go far enough through it. And the answer when it comes to Van Allen belt is, okay, they might not go all the way through it, but there's plenty of astronauts who spent time in the Van Allen belt, actually spent longer in the Van Allen belt of radiation than the Apollo astronauts as they fired through it, because they were traveling at momentum. So it's not the distance through the Van Allen belt that matters when it comes to radiation. It's not how far you travel in radiation. It's how long you're exposed. That's the nuance of the point there. But you can see that Phil hasn't got a chance to even talk about any of the other things, because for the 3 minutes that Joe was given, Phil was given 20 seconds and Joe is in on him. Yeah,
exactly. No, that's a great point, Marsh. And I think, when you say immediately, as soon as we hear this clip start, you hear Penn immediately start glazing Joe. He's so humble. I would argue that humility and being humble means if somebody answers your question, you should listen to them, right? Like, that's what I would think humble is. Joe's trying to make a joke about it. And also, he's trying to make it seem like even a dummy like me can come up with these reasons why this is such a fraud. That's why Joe's doing it. It's very specifically a rhetorical device for him to try to put another crowbar in there to pull it out. But Penn is either so enamored with Joe that he can't let that go and he's got to talk about it, or he just misses it completely. I'm not sure. But this is exactly how you point out. Like, Joe is basically allowed to push as far as he can in 3 minutes. And then for every single point, he's fighting inch by inch on the way back. So every second is an inch by inch basis. And it makes it sound like Phil doesn't have his shit together. But it's because Phil was nice and just let him talk about all his nonsense for 3 straight minutes.
Yeah. And that's interesting. You raise the point on humility. You're absolutely right. I mean, I would argue humility is if I have zero education in something and I'm talking to someone who has spent like 20 years or more in that field, I might listen to what they have to say before dismissing it. Yeah. Just listen. Like, Phil's got a PhD in this stuff. But now at this point, we're going granular on that one single point about the Van Allen belt. And we're at risk of not being able to even address this point fully, let alone anything else that Joe ran through in that unbroken 3-minute string of all of his arguments. And that is the effect of the Gish Gallop. Now, there are some ways to deal with the Gish Gallop. One thing you can do, and I think Phil does that a bit here, is you point to it. You hang a lamp on it. Along the lines of, obviously, you just went through a lot of points there, and I'm never going to have the time to be able to respond to every single one of those in detail. So what you can do is you can even say to them, so given that I've not got time to go into them all in detail, which of those points that you just raised do you think is the most convincing, the most concrete? Because we'll start with that one. And then when they pick that one, and then if you're able to explain why it doesn't hold up, they're almost certainly going to say, yeah, but what about this? But then you can point out, well, we agree that your most convincing evidence doesn't hold up.
Exactly, yeah.
So we're going to move on to something that even you said is less convincing than that, but you think that is the one that will that will nail it then.
That's a great way to do that. I like that strategy. Phil does, I think, address basically all the points. He tries to pop all those quick balloons really quickly by saying, oh, they're all very similar to a lot of other points that are brought up online, and they're all very easily debunked and thoroughly debunked online. And I think that's a way to deal with it. But what I think that does is that would make a person who's sort of already inclined to side with Joe think that you're just hand-waving those things away rather than trying to point to them. And that was the strategy Joe had when he came into this conversation, was to just do a data dump that you can't deal with in the time that you're given. Okay, so we skip ahead a little bit, and here's the next sort of portion of the argument.
Yeah, but everyone has been promising a return to the moon, from George Sr. to George Jr. I don't think Clinton ever promised it, but let me read to you an interesting quote that Clinton said. This is from his book. This is page 156 of his book, My Life. And he says, just a month before, he's talking about a conversation that he had with someone a month after the Apollo 11 landing. He says, just a month before, Apollo 11 astronauts Buzz Aldrin and Neil Armstrong left their colleague Michael Collins aboard Spaceship Columbia and walked on the moon, beating by 5 months President Kennedy's goal of putting a man on the moon before the decade was out. The old carpenter asked me if I really believed it happened. I said, sure, I saw it on television. He disagreed. He said he didn't believe it for a minute that them television fellers could make things look real that weren't. Back then I thought he was a crank. During my 8 years in Washington, I saw some things on TV that made me wonder if he wasn't ahead of his time.
You mean Clinton might have said something that turned out not to be right?
Well, not to
oh,
be.
You should publish this.
I understand what you're saying, but isn't that an odd thing to say for a guy who was the president, a two-term president of the United States of America? That's a weird thing to say. To even imply, even hint that possibly we didn't go to the moon.
Well, listen, Joe. We are going to take a commercial break, and we're going to keep you on board, and we're going to come back with Joe Rogan, the host of Fear Factor, against Phil Plait, the astronomer.
Hey, man, this is no battle. I'm no knowledgeable person. I know nothing. I am very honored to have this conversation.
You're doing a great job, Joe.
Yeah. And it's great. And genuinely, I think we're like 20 minutes into the discussion at this point. Genuinely, I think Joe is honored to be having this conversation. I will give Joe credit to that at this point. We've seen him when it comes to having conversations with people. He does feel honored talking to someone that he thinks really knows something about something. He's willing to do that. I would argue that we'll see throughout this conversation and actually throughout the next conversation, that sense of being honored by simply being part of the conversation dissipates somewhat.
Goes away
for
eventually.
Rogan.
Yeah.
But this point that he's making for Bill Clinton here, Bill Clinton wasn't agreeing with the old man in the story that we didn't go to the moon just because them fellers on TV can sure do a good job at faking reality. I think he's just more likely to be agreeing with the guy like that. It's ahead of his time in saying that TV can make things look real and make people believe stuff that isn't real, which it can, and it can right now, and it was increasingly getting that way back then. That's really all he's saying here.
Yeah. It feels like a reading comprehension problem on Joe's part more than anything else. Even as he's reading it, if you don't hear that in there, you're really stretching. You're really reaching.
Yeah, and in fairness, even in this conversation, Penn, most of his participation in this conversation is to sort of sit back and watch the spectacle play out and be delighted by the some of the shit that Joe is flinging, essentially. But even in this bit, Penn pushes back and says, I think he's talking about kind of the magic of television here. I think he's talking about kind of TV's ability to fake stuff. So even Penn is coming in to explain that point, maybe because Phil wasn't expecting this point. And so his debunking of this point is kind of not really here nor there, really. Like, oh yeah, Clinton might be wrong about stuff. Yeah, that's a good point. But I think Penn's kind of reading on it is an even more persuasive thing. What I think is interesting is I think it's one of these situations that Joe cites a source that he wouldn't usually trust.
Yeah, it's a great point.
He's citing, a senior. I mean, okay, we're not going to say that Joe was a Republican at the time, but he certainly wasn't a Democrat at the time, and he certainly wasn't like a rah government kind of guy. He's citing this because it happens to agree with him, and he doesn't really care what the source is. It doesn't have any credibility issues if it's on his side and agrees with him.
Yeah, and I mean, also presidents can just be dumbasses and say stupid shit. That's also a possibility. Or they could be writing a joke that goes over your head, which is, I think, clearly what this is, or a jab at the media in this particular instance. I think all of those things can be true. A lot of times you embellish when you write, so all those things can be possible. But Joe, of course, thinks it's coming from an authority that I'm choosing at this point to believe.
Yeah. And the thing is, what Bill Clinton thinks just isn't pertinent to what actually happened in the 1960s.
Exactly.
Even if we grant Joe that this is Bill Clinton thinking that that Bill Clinton is admitting he's a moon landing denier, for example, that doesn't have any bearing, and that's not what's happening here. But even if we grant Joe that, it doesn't have any bearing on whether we went to the moon or not. This isn't evidence for that, and it just shows that. I mean, we're like I said, this is 19 minutes in. Joe gave that 3-minute bit. They've gone through some of Joe's points, and this is where Joe has regressed to, and it just shows how flimsy the evidence is that he's relying on, how actually there's not really a great deal of there unless you desperately want to believe. And actually, a lot of the rest of this conversation, I say this is 19 minutes in, the conversation is about 45 minutes long, because it's like an hour long with some ad breaks in there. And the rest of this conversation, it talks about like the absence of blast craters around the lunar landing module or the other things on the moon. So like, why weren't there blast craters? And Phil's explaining the lack of atmosphere and the way that things react in such a small amount of gravity, and what the actual regolith of the moon was like, and what the texture of it was like, and how you wouldn't have a massive blast crater because when you're that close to the moon, you're not trying to like blast at it, you're trying to gently lower yourself on. Yeah. He explains all of this kind of stuff. And to be honest, for the most part in the rest of this first conversation, Phil does a really good job of answering Joe's arguments, or lots of Joe's arguments. Yeah. And it's a point that we both noted it when we were kind of going through, but there's not one clip that illustrates it. As the conversation starts to go on, once we're past like the 35-minute mark, something like that, Joe starts to sound increasingly agitated, increasingly worked up. And I think it's because he's getting the sense that it isn't going the way he was expecting it to. He thought he'd come in with this arsenal of evidence that even the bad astronomer would not be able to argue with it. And I think he seems like he's getting more and more agitated in this. We can't play that because it just wouldn't quite fit into the flow of the show, because it's not one particular clip that shows it. But this conversation runs out of time. And so 3 weeks later, they reconvene the 23rd of February 2007. This time, Joe's the one in the studio. Yeah. So he's the one who's flown to Penn in Vegas. Phil's the one dialing in from the phone. And I think we get a very, very different conversation here. And actually, I reached out to Phil Plait to ask him about this. And what his interpretation was, he thought the first conversation was pretty convivial, pretty friendly. And he expected that this time too. But like, Phil's summation of this was what you and I both felt, was Joe comes out swinging in
sure
this
does.
One. He's not here for a friendly conversation at this point.
Sure does. And so this is the very beginning of the next show. This is, like Marsh says, happening a couple weeks later, and they're going to start framing this particular argument.
So I guess since Joe started last time on the phone with explaining his questions about
what I want to say to anybody who is listening to this, who's like,
and we're starting with Joe again.
Well, I'm sorry. I'm just going to a disclaimer. I will let you start for sure.
No,
I'm not going to make any points.
I'm ready for you.
All I'm saying, and all I said before is, I am not claiming to be a scientist. I am not claiming to be anybody who's got any secret knowledge. I'm not claiming that I know something you don't. All I'm saying is I'm not afraid of looking ridiculous, and I think a lot of people are. And I think when you look at all this evidence, a lot of people look at it and they go, well, of course we landed on the moon, and they don't want to look any further, and they stop right there. What I'm saying is the more I look at stuff, the more I see inconsistencies. I see all kinds of weird behavior from the astronauts. I see all sorts of weird photographic anomalies. I saw all sorts of weird stuff with radiation. There's a lot of weird stuff. And one of the reasons why I wanted to come on the radio with you is because I wanted to be able to ask someone about these things, because all I'm getting is what I'm getting online. And I know you run a debunking website, right? I mean, Is that what you do for a living?
That would be badastronomy.com for all of you in front of a computer. No, I don't do it for a living, actually. I create educational activities for students. Actually.
Have you ever worked for NASA, or are you employed by them in any way?
Not officially. I worked at Goddard Space Flight Center for a few years, which is a NASA center, but I was a contractor. I worked for a company, not NASA. I've never been a civil servant.
And
Bart Sabrell, one of these big moon hoax guys, he went on the air once and accused me of having a NASA paycheck, which is not true. I've never had a NASA paycheck. And then a couple of years ago, I went back to Goddard after I stopped working there about 5 years ago. A couple of years ago, I went back to give a talk, and they reimbursed me, and I actually had a NASA check with my name on it. Damn, you got me now.
Amazing.
So, yeah, so much for Joe letting Phil start here. He even says,
right.
I'm going to let you start. I'm not going to make any points. Did that sound like a man who wasn't making any points? And that's 3 minutes or 2 minutes of clip there.
He talks for two straight minutes.
What we get instead is Joe restating all of the same points that he made in the first conversation, including the ones that they talked about and the ones that Phil explained the real reasoning behind. Now, you could say, if you're being charitable to Joe, he's summarizing why this conversation happened and summarizing what he felt going into that first conversation. Maybe that's true. Maybe he's saying, I had all these thoughts about radiation and things, and that's why I want to have this conversation. But it does sound like Joe wasn't really honestly listening with an eye to change in his mind when Phil explained the things about radiation, stuff like that. And if you hear this conversation and you didn't check out the first one, it's going to sound like Joe had all those points and Phil didn't have any answers for them. But he did. We heard that. And also, while Joe is here saying, I'm going to let Phil start, I'm definitely going to let Phil start, he is also going to poison the well before he does that. Yeah, well, Phil, you run a debunking website. And did you ever work for NASA?
Exactly.
Did you work for NASA?
Yeah. He's already got points. And I think this is tricking Penn because he can't stop talking about how humble Joe is and how. But genuinely, like, this isn't humility. He's being disingenuous. He's not asking for answers. He didn't take. I guess maybe he took one because in the first one, we didn't play his reaction to the Van Allen belt bit, but he does seem to give up that point. He concedes that point. And then he moves on to something else pretty quickly after that. But he mostly concedes. He doesn't try. He pushes back 3 or 4 times, but Phil's so solid on that point that he can't, there's no room, there's no wiggle. So he just moves on to something else. And throughout the whole thing, he's just pushing back every chance he gets, every inch Phil has to fight for. And then Joe gets to come on and filibuster again for a few minutes and poison the well and ask leading questions. And very specifically, I think like this is the problem with just asking questions, right? Because you're not ready to get the answers, man. You're not asking for answers. You're literally just using the questions as another wedge.
Yeah, absolutely. It's the difference between asking questions and just asking questions. Like in the first of those, you might want some answers. In the second one, you're just asking questions. You don't want answers.
Exactly.
You're just asking questions. I also wonder with this thing about NASA, he says, Phil runs a debunking website. Did you work for NASA? I wonder if between that conversation and this one, he's looked Phil up and maybe even seen what people have said about Phil and thought he's bringing something of a gotcha question in these two as well. And because I wonder whether he's like Bart Sibrel has said that Phil worked for NASA. Maybe Joe has seen that because Bart Sibrel might be crazy. He might think all sorts of stuff that's not real, but is everything he says wrong? Maybe he's got a point on some stuff. I wonder if that's happened there.
Possibly. That's interesting. This next clip, they're going back and forth for a moment. It's a couple minutes, maybe a minute in between the previous clip and this one. And this is when Phil starts to talk about some of the evidence of why we actually went, there's proof that we actually went to the moon.
One of the things is that there is hard physical evidence of this. For example, the astronauts over the course of 6 missions brought back 800 pounds of rocks and dust from the moon. And this stuff is really weird. I mean, it's clearly not formed on the Earth. You can go through all the scientific analysis and say, yes, this stuff clearly was formed in a low-gravity, waterless environment. It has all of the telltale signs of having spent time in an atmosphereless, does that even make sense? An airless environment. This stuff's been looked at by scientists from all over the world, and they all look at it and say, yeah, that's from the moon.
All right, can I stop you right there for a second?
Okay, so we didn't actually play the whole thing there. Phil had been talking slightly longer than that, but that's kind of the end bit, which is important. This was Joe letting Phil start, but obviously only letting Phil start after Joe's made a few points. Sure. It's not really start at that point. Yeah. It's like you get to do your thing at that point. So Phil lays out his case. He has about 2 minutes or less than 2 minutes to lay out the case for the evidence that we did go to the moon. Joe had 3 minutes of all of the evidence that we didn't. And the question to Phil was, can you bring the evidence that we did? And so at the start of it, he kind of does a prelude to getting to his point about how hard it is to prove definitively where we went to the moon in a way that somebody couldn't kind of dispute in any kind of way. But he gets to this first point about the actual moon rocks that were brought back and how they look nothing like anything formed on Earth or anything found on Earth. And as soon as he gets into this first point, Joe immediately interrupts.
Sure
Can I
does.
stop you there for a second?
Yeah.
This is asymmetry. We're going to talk in the toolbox about the asymmetry of these kind of conversations, that the rules only apply to one person in these kind of conversations, and things that work for one person would trip up another person or would be counted as discrediting for another person. This is some asymmetry. And so what we're actually going to see is Joe stopping Phil in the middle of talking about the moon rock to ask a question about that. But the question isn't going to be about the nature of the moon rock, which is the evidence that Phil's talking about. You know, when you examine it, it very clearly looks like it did not, didn't originate on Earth, and it doesn't even look like the moon rock that we gather on Earth that have hit from meteorites. That's what Joe's talking about. That's what Phil's talking about. This is going to be Joe's question on the moon rock.
Yeah, sure. Let's about go. That. First of all, Werner von Braun went to Antarctica in 1967 in the height of the moon race and collected moon rocks from Antarctica. Isn't that true? Like hundreds of pounds.
I have heard.
There's photographs of him. There's videos of him there. There's moon rocks that they brought back. There's video of them carrying stuff back. He went in 1967, 2 years before Apollo.
I have not seen the documentation for this, and I've looked around, but I haven't.
You haven't seen the photograghs of him in Antarctica? You haven't seen? I mean, that's very clear. That's all over the place.
Are they online? I can look that up.
Absolutely. I can't believe you don't know that. You don't. Well, you haven't heard that argument that Werner von Braun was in Antarctica? Why would he go to Antarctica in the middle of the most heated technological race in human history, and he's at the helm of it for the United States of America, and he's going to Antarctica and he's bringing back rocks?
I've heard this story too, but I've honestly I have not found a lot of stuff about this. And
that's ridiculous. It's all over the internet. It's all over everywhere. It's been documented. I've seen it in videos. All over the No, not conspiracy sites. It's all over legitimate sites. I've seen it on a bunch of different sites. It's documented. Werner von Braun was in Antarctica in 1967, 2 years before Apollo, and he was bringing back rocks.
Okay, then
not only that, he was a Nazi. A huge, evil Nazi war criminal who, by the way, the Simon Wiesenthal Center said would be prosecuted for crimes against humanity if he was alive today, for sure.
He worked for the Nazis. I don't think he was a Nazi. That's a whole
Werner von Braun
story.
ran a rocket factory where they hung the 5 slowest workers a day in front of the rocket factory. There's people that have talked about it. There's guys that have showed their tattoos and discussed it. And seen Werner von Braun walk by as they were working.
Von Braun. Just to jump in here, totally separate from any moon hoax site, I just pulled up with a quick search many pictures of Werner von Braun in Antarctica.
Yeah, it's kind of weird that you would dispute that. I don't understand.
No, I'm not disputing it.
So listen to how Joe is behaving here compared to that first conversation, that congenial conversation that we heard where he was being so humble about everything. And then also compare it to how he's been characterized by Penn about how he's so smart, he's so humble, he's so gentle. Like, what he's doing here, he's interrupting. He's talking over Phil. He's dismissive. He's absolutely on the attack. And this is 5 minutes in. So what we've had is like, hey, Joe, you were so humble last time. Great. I'm going to let Phil start. But before I do that, aren't you on NASA's payroll? And don't you run a debunking website? And then 1-2 minutes into Phil's point, this is where that goes. And Phil's point was, when you look at moon rock, it looks different to rock on Earth. And Joe's question is, but didn't von Braun go to Antarctica?
Yeah, and then when Phil doesn't know exactly whether or not he went to Antarctica or not, he says, I'm not sure. And he says, well, it's all over the place. It's all over the place. 1, being all over the place doesn't make it true. And 2, him not knowing the travel schedule of Werner von Braun doesn't dismiss any of the points he made.
Yeah, like he's an astrophysicist, not a historian. He doesn't need to be looking at what former Nazis did when they were on their holidays. Yeah. Well, not their holidays, but you see my point. What this is Joe deflecting.
Yes.
Phil's point is about the physical evidence of regolith that was gathered from the moon, the actual moon surface, the moon rocks.
Yes.
What do those rocks look like? And how do they compare to rocks that have been formed in the atmosphere of the Earth? Because if these don't look like rocks that formed in the atmosphere of Earth, they didn't come from Earth. If they don't look like the rocks that came from space and landed on Earth, they didn't come from space and land on Earth. They could only have come from when we went into space and gathered them. That's the important thing that Phil's pointing out here. And Joe's, can I just stop you there and ask a question, is about the time Werner von Braun went to Antarctica. That isn't relevant at all. Where Werner von Braun was at any given time has no bearing on the composition of the regolith collected. And then, once we've done this sidetrack, we've done this distraction, we're not talking about the substance, literally the substance in this case, he's starting to anomaly hunt. Well, isn't it weird? Why would he go there at that time, right in the middle of the Cold War, right in the middle of the technological race, and he goes to Antarctica? How could you possibly explain that? We're anomaly hunting. Like, there might be reasons. Phil probably doesn't know those reasons because they're not relevant to the evidence of the moon or not. And when Phil doesn't know it, Joe then characterizes it, as you say, of dispute, as if Phil is disputing that it happened. Phil can just not know that because it's not relevant to what looking at the moon rock tells us about where that rock came from. But because this distraction was thrown in, we then get onto a side conversation about whether Werner von Braun was a committed Nazi or whether he was just working for the Nazis. But like, whether Werner von Braun, Joe's evidence here is that Werner von Braun ran a rocket factory and that the factory killed the slowest workers. That doesn't prove his point because, for one thing, you could be the science guy at the we will kill insubordinate workers plant, and maybe you potentially don't want to object to those deaths because you don't want to seem insubordinate or you're going to be killed next.
Yeah, maybe.
But fuck it, we'll go the other way. Maybe Werner von Braun was responsible. Maybe even he had the idea to kill them. Either way, that says nothing at all about whether we landed on the moon, and it says nothing at all about the chemical composition of regolith.
Right.
These are all just distractions. They're sometimes known as dead cat distractions. And if you want to distract someone from the conversation that you're having because you can't really get out of that conversation, you can't really justify the conversation, you drop a dead cat on the desk, and now the whole conversation is about why you just dropped a dead cat on the desk. That's what this is. We're debating now how much of a Nazi Werner von Braun is, and not what does an analysis of regolith look like. Even from Joe giving Phil the space to explain the evidence that proved we landed on the moon, he's just immediately diverted to this place incredibly quickly.
Yeah. And what Joe's trying to do here is he's making some incredible leaps of logic that whether or not they're true or not doesn't matter. It's sort of just like you suggest to undermine these other points. So when Phil brings up these moon rocks, which are an absolute nail in the coffin to many of the arguments that any of these people have against whether or not we landed on the moon, you can't recreate this somewhere else. This is very specifically from another planet. You can't do that here. He just immediately starts to talk about, well, why did he grab him? What is this? Why is he a Nazi? And what he's doing is he's tying all these pieces together. What he's saying is like, we can't believe Nazis, and because they're bad, and therefore a Nazi might try to fake it. And in order to fake it, they might travel to Antarctica. Now, he doesn't say any of those things, right? He doesn't say those out loud. He doesn't explicitly say that. But he very much is trying to draw the listener in to say, well, hold on a second. He was a Nazi. Hold on a second. Why was he down there? He's basically pushing you to be like, you need to make this conclusion for yourself, but I will drag you there to show you that this conclusion is what you want to get to. And he's not going to explicitly make it, but he is going to draw everybody there with these questions that he has about the background of this person and where they got these things, even though neither of those things matter. Nor would it even show it because they do have rocks from Antarctica and they don't look like these rocks. So it literally doesn't matter, but he's trying to convince everybody that they're lying about it.
Yeah, and he wants the conversation to be on his terms at this point.
Yeah.
He wants to be only on the grounds that he wants to be discussing.
Okay, so they're going to continue talking about Antarctica in this next clip. We're not skipping any tape.
Well, then I have a question for you. If they were to fake the moon landings and there were some people in there and that were going to do this, why would they send von Braun to Antarctica? Why would they take pictures of von Braun? And then why would they say, look, von Braun went to Antarctica? Why even do that? If this is going to be a secret thing and you're going to go to Antarctica to collect rocks, it doesn't make sense to send your rocket.
There's a lot of things that don't make sense, but the fact is he was in Antarctica. He did bring back moon rocks.
They brought back some meteorites
from the moon.
They didn't bring. I don't think they brought back hundreds of pounds.
They brought back hundreds of pounds. If you find it, it's available all over the place.
Okay, well, I'm just going to have. Okay, I'll just grant you that. There are.
But isn't that weird? Doesn't that seem weird to you? That first of all, they would lie to the public and they have this evil Nazi running the United States of America's space program. And 2 years before we go to Apollo 11, 2 years before that, this guy's in Antarctica collecting rocks from the moon.
Well, what does his being a Nazi have to do with anything?
Well, they're lying, first of all. They're bringing back this evil criminal from Germany, and they're having him work for America. They're slicking his hair back and making him look nice in a suit, and this guy's an evil piece of crap.
So Phil raises a very good question here. Okay, we're going to follow you onto your ground. They sent Werner von Braun to Antarctica in order to help them fake the moon landing. If you're going to fake the moon landing, why would you send your number one highly visible Nazi to Antarctica to do that when anybody could go to Antarctica and collect a rock? I mean, a rocket scientist maybe isn't even the best person to do Antarctic exploring. He might be just much better being in the lab with a chalkboard, essentially. It doesn't mean that he's the guy out there collecting rocks.
Exactly.
You don't need to do that.
Yeah.
And Joe's way of answering that question is to completely dodge it. Oh, yeah, there's lots of things that don't make sense, but we do know he was there. Okay, it doesn't matter whether he was there or not. That wasn't the question here. But yeah, if you're going to do the secret mission to collect rocks, that you're going to use those rocks to fake the moon landing, don't send your main guy to take the photos. And Joe can't answer that, so he has to distract onto something else, onto the how much of a Nazi and how evil he was and what does it mean about the US government. And there's an interesting thing Phil does in the middle of this as well, where Joe is saying, like Phil says, it wasn't that many moon rocks that they brought back to Antarctica. And Joe is saying, it's hundreds of pounds. And Phil pauses for a while and says, okay, I'll grant you that. And what he's doing there, and I think it's very smart, is not trying to get into a conversation about exactly what the weight of meteorite recovered from Antarctica was, because that says nothing at all about whether we landed on the moon. So he can't fact check in the moment, but he recognizes it's just not worth disputing that because even if Joe is right, it proves nothing and it changes nothing.
Yeah, but Joe, throughout this whole thing, Phil even pushes back and says, what does that have to do with anything? And Joe very clearly fills in the blanks that he was unwilling to do a moment ago, lassoing all these things, being like, he's an evil piece of crap. He's going to lie to you. He's down there collecting moon rocks, and these rocks came from the moon. They were meteorites from the moon specifically. So he's still like, I'm going to connect these dots whether you let me do it or not. I'm just going to start tying all these push pins together, whether you agree here or not. And that's what he's trying to do to try to convince the listener. This is clearly not trying to convince Phil of anything. He's trying to reach out to listeners like Penn and other people who are listening to this thing to try to convince them that he's right and to try to undermine any points that Phil has. All right, so now they shift into, we're not skipping any tape, but they start talking a little bit about whether or not he was a Nazi, an actual Nazi, maybe he wasn't a Nazi, and that's this portion.
It was never really hidden that he was a Nazi. I think it was downplayed because he worked for...
come on, man. They did not admit that Werner von Braun was a Nazi.
I'm not going to say he was a Nazi. I know he worked for the Nazis at Pina Mundi.
You denied it.
I denied what?
You denied that he was a Nazi.
When he first said Nazi, you denied it. So you didn't say, you said no one denied it.
I don't mean to say that he's not a Nazi or is a Nazi. I'm saying that I don't know if he was a Nazi.
Well, I'm saying he's a Nazi.
Nazis for sure.
I'm saying he's a Nazi.
At their rocket plant, he was building rockets for the Nazis. The V2, which was used to bomb London.
Well, dude, he wore the Nazi uniform. What do you have to do to be a Nazi? Do you have to have video you cutting a Jew's head off? What do you have to do?
No, but there were Jews who were working in the rocket plant too. They weren't Nazis, and they were working.
They were slaves, dude. This guy wasn't a slave. He was at the head of the program.
I'm saying that von Braun's history is, well, I don't think it's that clear over whether he agreed with Hitler. I don't think he did.
Are you a von Braun apologist?
No.
This is getting weirder and weirder.
But what you're doing is you're sort of poisoning the well here. You're calling him a Nazi.
No. What I'm doing is I'm pointing out that the government did something really evil. They brought back a criminal, a horrible person, and they had him run America's space program.
And just listen to how on the attack Joe is in these clips here. This now, as we're into the second conversation, we're only 10 minutes in, And this is where Joe is. Just listen to the way he's yelling, no, over the top of Phil Plait in order to that Phil can't get a word in, can't make a point. This is not now a debate, a conversation. This is not humility. This is not, as Penn said, delivering it with great force and great humor and great humility that he's so eloquent talking about it. This is just a man shouting over someone who's trying to explain things to him and also directing this into a completely meaningless area because, again, how much of a Nazi Werner von Braun is says nothing at all about whether human beings landed on the moon. Is Joe arguing that the Nazis couldn't have landed on the moon due to their Nazi-ness? Like, there's nothing about how evil you are and how bigoted you are and how much scientific progress you're capable of making in astrophysics. These two things were separate. So it's completely irrelevant. And he's doing this because I would argue for two things. One, he can't answer the start of this conversation, which was Phil Plait talking about regolith and moon rock and stuff. He can't answer to that. But also, two, this is 3 weeks after that first conversation that I think he went into thinking, I'm going to have some really good points to make to Phil Plait here, and he's not going to have anything to say to them. And he had things to say to them, and he batted them all back, and he pointed out. And I think Joe was stung by that. We've seen Joe in the modern day get stung by people making him look like a fool. As much as he said, I'm willing to be foolish, I'm willing to, look like an idiot, I'm willing to do that. He said that in this conversation. He's willing to do it to himself. He's not willing to have it done to him. And so I think he looked wrong in that first conversation. I think it stung him. And I have no insight into this. I think this second conversation only happens because of how bad the first one went for Joe. Yeah. And so he called up his good buddy Penn Jillette, and this time I'll be the one in studio, and this time I'll come out on the I think he's thought about this, and I think he's trying to reclaim ground and reclaim his ego to some degree here.
Yeah, look at how he talk shit with his friend about Douglas Murray after the thing was over, right? After it's all over and Douglas Murray comes in. And now, don't get me wrong, we didn't agree with Douglas Murray for about half that conversation. But his points on Russia, Ukraine had a lot of interesting pieces. And he immediately afterwards start talking shit about him when he thought he lost. So he does have an ego, and it can be bruised.
Yeah. And I think this is why it's good to go back and look at this conversation, because Joe Rogan today disagrees with Joe Rogan then, but they are very clearly the same guy.
Very clearly,
and you can hear Joe Rogan today in the things that Joe Rogan then is, the way that Joe Rogan then is talking.
Absolutely. So they cut to commercial shortly after that last clip, and this is them coming back to talk again after the commercial break.
And he just is just shocking me to death, because when he first talked about this moon landing thing, I thought it was a weird little quirk that he had. He just knows so goddamn much about it.
Here's the thing, man. I'm not crazy, but I just want to explain this. I don't look for stuff like this. I didn't want this to come up. I'm not like the guy who's trying to find, I see all sorts of retarded arguments in these conspiracy theorists. I see them left and right. I see retarded arguments in any kind of conspiracy, whether it's 9/11 or who shot Kennedy, or it's the driver, he turned around. There's all sorts of retarded stuff, but there's stuff that makes sense, and you can't throw it all out. And when you look at it all, when you look at the giant picture, there's so much wrong with the Apollo missions. There's so much wrong. Massive amounts of stuff that doesn't make sense. And that's why I'm a busy person. I'm not looking into this because I'm bored. I'm looking into this because I was really disturbed. I mean, and the deeper I went, the more I realized there's something really wrong going on here.
So Penn starts this clip by saying that, it's just he's so shocking because he just knows so goddamn much about this. But he doesn't know much about the moon landing. He doesn't. What he knows is the collection of things he happens to have seen from the places, I'm not going out looking for this stuff, but you can hear Phil Plait laugh at that because he clearly is. Sure. He's clearly gone through all of the same websites that share all of the same false things. So, what does he know about it? He knows that Werner von Braun visited Antarctica and was a Nazi, but he doesn't know the difference between moon rock and earth rock that would render all of that completely irrelevant. He knows that astronauts haven't been through the Van Allen belt other than the Apollo 11 astronauts, but he doesn't know that astronauts have spent longer in the Van Allen belt than Apollo 11 astronauts, and therefore have been exposed to more radiation than the Apollo 11 astronauts and are fine. So, he knows the conspiracy theory, but he doesn't know anything more than that, and he hasn't bothered looking for anything more than that. And what even in this clip here, Joe is trying to argue that, yeah, sure, there's a lot of people out there who believe this who are cranks, and a lot of stuff they say is obviously wrong, but not all of it is wrong. Therefore, we shouldn't discount any of it. But that's not how this works. What you do is you bring an argument and you evaluate it. You see whether it's true or not. You see if it holds up, whether there's other explanations, other corroborating evidence or disconfirmatory evidence. And if it doesn't hold up, you throw it away. You can't point to the quantity of bad arguments and suggest that all those bad arguments add up to or even must inevitably contain some good arguments. You need to evaluate the arguments and find the good ones and ignore all the bad ones. And he's not doing that because there aren't any good ones.
Yeah, that's a great point, Marsh. And I think we look at how Joe is arguing throughout this whole thing, and he keeps reverting back to feeling. He's saying this feels off. Something smells. He says that later on. I think we got a clip of him saying that.
He was disturbed, is what he says. I was so disturbed
by it. Yeah, he doesn't have to present anything that proves his point, as long as he's sort of relating to the audience that his intuition is right. There's something with his intuition. And if you think about this, your intuition will be off too. He doesn't have to refute any of the data points that Phil brings up. And in fact, Joe doesn't bring up any either. I mean, what he's trying to do is make you feel icky because there was a Nazi involved. That's what he's trying to do throughout this whole, most of this tape is him talking about Nazis. And it's like, that doesn't have anything to do with it unless you're trying to make the audience feel uneasy about it.
Yeah, this is Joe 20 years ago when he was uncomfortable about there being Nazis associated with the U.S. government.
Now he talks to him on his show. He praises him when Dave comes in, when this buddy Dave comes in. They praises Nazis like Nick Fuentes. All right, next up, they're talking more about these moon rocks. They sort of circle back to that, and that's that. But this is that bit of tape.
Okay, so we covered the
moon rocks.
Moon rocks.
No, we got an explanation. We have a plausible explanation.
We got a little sidetracked with the whole Nazi thing.
Right, you did. So let's go on with the moon rocks.
The arguments against von Braun that you brought up, von Braun went to Antarctica. Why would you send your rocket scientist?
I don't know, but he was there. I don't know, but he was there, and he brought back rocks.
Second of all, he was there in 1967 or 1968.
67.
It wasn't until 1969 that Japanese scientists first identified Antarctica as having a lot of meteorites. So it doesn't make sense that if he went there 2 years before it was even understood that meteorites went there. I don't know why he went there. I don't think it was to pick up meteorites. And even if he did, that wouldn't have been enough time for them to prepare these rocks and get them to make it look like Neil Armstrong put them up. There's not enough time because the rocks that come from the moon look very different than the lunar meteorites that are found on the surface of the Earth.
Right, but didn't the Soviet Union bring back lunar meteorite samples, and didn't they do it with an unmanned craft? And didn't the samples that the United States government sent out for independent verification, those are very small samples, tiny, sugar cube sized?
No, you can get bigger slices than that. And
you can, but where are they? It's a federal crime to be in possession of moon rocks. Why do you think that would be?
Because there's only 800 pounds of them, and it costs $35 billion to get them. If you want to examine bigger ones, you have to go to NASA to do that, where they've got these things stored in very, very scientifically controlled conditions.
So it's interesting. So we've played the last few clips have basically been back to back, but not a moment really cut out of them. And so Penn is the one trying to move on from the moon rock conversation because he says we've dealt with that. But we haven't dealt with that. Well done for Phil Plait to bring back to that, because when Phil brought up what moon rocks look like, Joe immediately sidetracked us off about how much of a Nazi Werner von Braun was. And because he had to poison that well. And clearly it worked on Penn.
It did.
Because Penn thinks, well, we've been talking about moon rocks for long enough. Let's move on. That's how that kind of distraction and filibustering and obfuscation works. The dead cat works. It's like Penn was quite happy to move on. Well done, Phil, for bringing this kind of back.
Penn failed at his own show, the Fool Us show. He got fooled by Joe. Yeah.
Yeah, he absolutely did. But even then, the whole point here wasn't whether Wernher von Braun went to Antarctica or not. All of this came from just that opening thing from Phil as how moon rocks could only have been gathered from the moon. That's the point here. And we do get back to that. And now Joe is trying to dismiss that point here with what he's saying.
Yeah, and he's trying to dismiss it by throwing out zingers, but they're literally explained without any real deep knowledge at all. It doesn't talk about anything scientific. Why is it a crime? Because they're about $2.7 million an ounce to actually collect them. So that's why it's a crime to have them. Real easy, super. You don't even have to know anything about science to hear that and think immediately, no, 100%, I'm on Phil's side on this. Yeah, absolutely. Why would it be a crime? Because of this. But again, Joe's trying to poison the well and trying to make it seem like the government doesn't want you to have them because they know they're fake. That's the underlying thing here. He doesn't explicitly say that out loud, but it's implied in how he delivers that line.
Yeah, and I love this thing about the moon having, like, it being in possession of moon rocks is a crime. Why would it be a crime? Well, you didn't get the moon rocks. You didn't go to the moon and get the moon rocks.
They would obviously
the only people who ever did do that want to store the moon rocks.
Yeah,
so the only way that you would have the moon rocks is if you stole them from those people. Like, it's not a crime to possess gold, but it is a crime to possess gold that's meant to be in Fort Knox. Because it means you've stolen from Fort Knox.
Bravo. So well. So good, man. All right. So, hey, we're just talking about some governmental lies. They're going to continue on in that vein right now.
Have you been to NASA where they have them? Have you been there?
Oh, man, no.
I have.
They don't let, flunkies like me in there. They let real jobs.
Just so you know, they let me in.
Well,
I was in there in the bunny suit and the whole deal. It was
That's right.
pretty awesome.
I don't think this proves anything either way, but what I am saying is that any government that'd be willing to lie about having a Nazi run their space program, I think they'd be willing to lie about moon rocks.
I don't think anybody lied about him being a Nazi. I think that it was public knowledge. I think everybody knew it. I think they said this is the best rocket scientist in the world, and we should damn well take advantage of the fact.
Was it public knowledge to the American public?
I believe it was.
So this, I think, shows the real purpose of Joe raising the whole Nazi element. He's saying here, any government that's willing to lie about having a Nazi run their space program is willing to lie about moon rocks. He's just saying if they lied about X, they must have lied about Y. But that line of reasoning only works if the only thing you have to go on is their word. But we don't.
Good point.
We've got the moon rocks.
Yeah, good point.
Like, it doesn't matter. They could say they got the moon rocks from George W. Bush's backyard that they dug them up. But we've got the moon rocks. We can compare them to other rocks, and we can compare them to the samples taken by the Soviet unmanned mission. We can see that now. It's been a long time we've had these to analyze. If we translate it fully, Joe's version of this is the government were willing to lie about how much of a Nazi that their rocket scientist was that they sent to Antarctica. So maybe they were also willing to lie about how they developed a program where tens of thousands of people were involved in a multi-million-dollar hoax to create fake footage and collect fake moon rocks that would only be convincing enough that no other scientist in the world would be able to spot the difference, and then send fake signals to hostile nations to convince them that the hoax was real. If they lied about the Nazi thing, they must have lied about the fact that they did that second one too. But the one thing doesn't support the other. Because you can prove they lied about anything doesn't mean you can everything else you say is true.
And the fact is that we did know he was associated with the Nazi party when he was in Germany. We knew that. The people, just normal, everyday people knew that. In fact, there was a satirist who wrote a song about Wernher von Braun 2 years before they went to the moon. So and that, a popular one too. I'm not just talking about but there was popular people who were talking about this. This was an important thing. We didn't care. That's the thing. We didn't care as long as he helped us win the space race with the Soviets. That's it. Well, the way Joe is presenting this is itself a lie, because he's trying to say, well, they knew they were trying to hide the fact that they weren't trying to hide the fact people knew who he was. What Joe is trying to do, he's trying to make it seem like you suggest that if they're willing to lie about this, they're willing to lie about this other thing. And it's like, well, even your own argument by your own standards falls apart when we find out that they weren't willing to lie about it because everybody knew it.
Yeah, exactly. Everyone did know it. They knew he was a Nazi, That's why they got him. Like Wernher von Braun was the rocket scientist whose technology was behind the V2 rockets, which were parts of the Nazis' bombing campaigns. That's why they went for him. He created the rockets behind the V2 bombers and the Blitzkrieg, and then the Blitzer things, and then they used those rockets to power their way to the moon. And as you say, this was well known. Like if you've ever seen the Stanley Kubrick film Dr. Strangelove. In that, Peter Sellers plays a Nazi physicist who is like the titular Dr. Strangelove who's working for the government. That was 1964. That was 5 years before the moon landing. Like, it was so common knowledge. It was, as you say, in cultural satire at the time. There was no lie about him being a Nazi.
Okay, so they start talking a little bit in this next clip about Russia.
And yet the next day, there was an article in the Russian newspaper that said Americans walked on the moon. And the Russians never doubted it.
I don't know. I don't know whether or not our wars with other countries, whether or not our propaganda, whether or not these arguments are all real, or whether it's the puppet on the left and the puppet on the right. I don't know who's at the helm of all this stuff. I don't know how it all works. I don't. But when I look at this whole gigantic picture, it smells.
Hey, who's at the bottom of all this? It's the aliens that are jerking us off, Joe. That's who it is. We have to know that. I mean, come on.
Yeah, exactly. Like, in order to accept that his worldview that the moon landing was hoaxed, Joe is now, at least then, in a position where he was willing to consider that the Cold War was fake because he's recycling an old Bill Hicks bit. Yeah. And this is how one conspiracy theory leads to another. Because when you come across holes in your worldview, you have to find something to plug them with. Yeah. And you can either find reality, which is going to dissolve your entire worldview, or you reach for whatever's to hand, which is another conspiracy theory. Yeah. But in doing so, you just import the holes in that conspiracy theory as well. And you forever are chasing your tail, plugging holes in your beliefs until suddenly you believe the Illuminati /lizards/Jews did it all.
So this last clip in our main event, they're talking about the motive for faking it or traveling to the moon.
Now, Joe, I want to ask you a question that you touch upon all the time, and you jump right to evil and wars and this kind of stuff. But on a little more lower level, what is really the motive here? I mean, if you have nuclear bombs, you can bomb them back into the Stone Age, and you have all these missiles, why show off the world that we can land a man on the moon?
I think to win the Cold War, or to try to give some sort of perceived victory in the Cold War, perceived victory of technological superiority over the Soviet Union. And I don't know whether or not it happened. I still am not convinced one way or another. But you are certainly not convincing me that we went, not by any stretch of the imagination, especially since the last time anybody even did a flyby of the moon was 1972. That's correct. Silly.
So, yeah, like, we went to the moon to win the Cold War. But literally 5 minutes before this, he wasn't sure the Cold War was real. But now he's suddenly, like 5 minutes later, he's back to the moon landing was fake to win a war that he's not convinced was definitely happening. So was the puppet on the left really pissed off with the puppet on the right? And that's why they really did have a Cold War? Like, what is he talking? There's no consistency because he doesn't need to be consistent. And we're going to cover the inconsistencies he's allowed in the toolbox, actually, in a moment.
Yeah, that's a great catch by you, Marsh. It's so funny to see him in these two clips, and I'm glad we placed them right next to each other so you could hear the difference in the two, the way he explains both of them. And to answer his last question, why didn't we return there since then? Like, who pays for that stuff? You know, it's already hard to get funds just for space missions alone, let alone saying, hey, we have to fly back by the moon because a bunch of conspiracy people are nuts about it and we've got to prove it to them that we can fly back to the moon. Like, they're just, and then they would just say that different footage is faked anyway. So it's not even a useful thing to do. There wasn't any necessity to do that. They had other things they wanted to do. That's why, Joe, it's so easy to answer all his questions. His questions are so simple, but he does a very good job, I think, in this whole thing of making people feel a little weird about it. And that's all he has to do. He doesn't have to push anything past any finish line. All he's got to do is disrupt the other argument.
Yeah, and it's interesting because if you were to stop Joe Rogan today, he wouldn't believe this stuff, but he would still think in the same way about lots of other things. Yes. And I'd like to ask Joe Rogan of today, how do I know that he did go on Penn Jillette's radio show in 2007, that he went to Vegas and did do that?
Yeah.
Because he might be able to pull out the ticket stubs from the flight that he took, and I could say that those are fake. He could play me the audio, and I could say that that doesn't mean that you were there, doesn't mean you were actually in the studio. You just recorded it and spliced it in. You could say that Penn Jillette testifies, and I could say that you've paid him off and he's lying. You could say that Phil Plait testifies, and I would say that, two sides of the conversation are actually puppets on hands of the same person, and this wasn't he couldn't present me any strong enough evidence that would be persuasive to me that this happened if I was motivated to find reasons to doubt that it happened. That's all he's doing here with the moon landing. And in today, with things like the COVID vaccine and the AIDS crisis and all that same kind of stuff.
And the great replacement theory.
Yeah.
All right. We're going to move on to our toolbox section.
So that's the toolbox, and something just fell out of the toolbox.
Okay, so for the toolbox this time, asymmetrical arguing.
Yeah, absolutely. So this is the first time we've really touched on what is meant to be a debate. We normally have like a conversation that we're looking at, but what we see here is the standard of evidence that's expected of Joe compared to the standard of evidence he expects of Phil Plait to be persuasive. And you can see that there is an asymmetry into what level of coherence, what level of strength of evidence, what level of proof, and also what level of consistency. Because Phil, not knowing a thing about Werner von Braun, is proof that we can dismiss what he thinks. But Joe is able to be wrong about all sorts of things, and that in no way undermines the credibility of his arguments to the people who believe in him. So this is where we see this asymmetry between the people who are trying to explain why a conspiracy theory isn't true, and how hard that is when the level of evidence required by the people putting forward that conspiracy, the level of consistency, is expected to be much lower. So we've got this kind of asymmetry kind of going on.
All right, so this is them talking about a sort of photographic phenomenon and the sort of anomalies that are behind that.
Well, I'll have to check that out. I've never really looked into it other than looking at the pictures on the internet and going, huh.
Sure, we can leave this one open, but...
Now, what about all those hot spots? It looks like there's like a light source behind people.
I was hoping you wouldn't bring this up. Not because it's a good point, but because it's really hard to explain without images. But basically, the argument goes, if you look at the Apollo astronauts, some of them look like they're standing in a spotlight, like there's somebody literally standing there with a spotlight beaming a circle of light on these guys. And this is actually a fairly complicated physical effect. It's got a German name. It's called Heiligenschein. And basically, it is how to explain this on the radio, right? Part of it has to do with the fact that when you're looking straight down the beam of light, when you're looking there are no shadows on the ground there. If you look off to the side, you see an object's shadow stretching behind it. But if you have a light shining on your head and you turn around and look at the shadow of your head, the light looks very bright there. It's a spotlight effect. I have pictures of this, actually, that I've taken in the infield of a baseball diamond. The dust has this peculiar property that it sort of throws light back in the direction it comes. So if you look at your own shadow, you're sort of seeing the sunlight reflecting off of the ground there stronger than around you. See, again, and people are in their cars thinking, this scientist guy is nuts. He's not making any sense. But this is what's going on. And in fact, if you get up early in the morning and there's dew on the grass and the sun is shining, you can actually see what looks like a soft glow around your head.
So this, I think, is a great example of the kind of asymmetry in this conversation. Joe said, what about the hotspots? And his arguments could be given in one sentence. The astronauts are standing in spotlights because they were shot on a soundstage. You can see they're in a spotlight. Sure. Now look at how hard Phil has to work to explain what's really going on here, how technical he has to get, how difficult it is to do even without visual aids. There's so much more work needs to go into this. And this, I would argue to the listener who's inclined to go either way on it, is going to sound way less persuasive than the thing that Joe said. It's going to sound like Phil is being evasive, and he's not. He's just explaining things.
Yeah, and I think, too, Phil does, in my opinion, in this debate, in both debates, he does an excellent job. I think mostly does a very excellent job. I think Joe, to me, comes off as very irrational and also, in some cases, pretty hysterical. We didn't play the last bit of the first episode, but he starts going off on that one, and he kind of continues it all through the second episode. So very irrational in a lot of ways. And I think Phil does a great job throughout. This is a piece that I don't think Phil should do, which is he sort of tries to defeat his own argument here, especially at the end when he's like, oh, this physicist guy he's talking nonsense. You don't need to do that. I think it's not, this is one of those pieces that you're just not going to be able to win on the radio. I think one of the things you have to do here is just sort of, you're not conceding the point. What you're saying is, this is too hard to describe without visuals. I'm going to confuse people. So I just have them go to my website or whatever. And the people who weren't going to believe you anyway, they're not going to believe you anyway. And the people who might be inclined might be able to do something else other than sort of listen to maybe a confusing example of how this works.
Yeah, exactly. Because to a lot of people, it's going to sound like what Phil is doing is hedging or failing to answer properly. And it's going to sound to them like Joe's point was so easy to understand. Why can't he explain it better? But the problem is Joe's wrong. And reality is more complex to understand because you don't get to make the rules about reality. You don't get to choose what's true. You have to try and describe what's true. And that's going to be harder than making up something that's false.
So we have a kind of another longer clip here that sets up a couple after. So this is the first part of that conversation talking about a cover-up.
Phil, what other evidence would you say says we've landed on the moon?
Well, a couple of big things, and the problem with most conspiracies is that you kind of pick away at the details, but you kind of forget the big picture, like the fact that there were 400,000 people working on this Apollo mission, and if it had been faked, if it had been faked because, and you have to ask yourself, why would they fake it? And generally, it's because and there was no way they could engineer these rockets. They couldn't go through the Van Allen belts. They couldn't go to the moon, whatever. These engineers knew what they were doing. These were the best, and I mean the best people that the U.S. could find. And if they were building machines that could not perform the way they wanted them to, they would have known it. If the rocket wouldn't have been able to get to the moon, they would have known it. If they couldn't have landed on the moon, they would have known it. The radiation issue is the same thing. And so it's sort of the same. When you look at when you look at Lewinsky Gate a few years back, right? I hope I can use the word.
Yeah.
If Bill Clinton's getting a in the Oval Office, right? Who knew about it? Clinton, Lewinsky, Linda Tripp, and most likely Hillary. You have four people who knew about this, and yet the news broke in a year? And the same with Watergate. This was a huge conspiracy that started small, and even the small stuff couldn't be kept hidden. And so there's just, I think it was Ben Franklin who said, 3 people can keep a secret if 2 of them are dead. And it's the same sort of thing here, except you're talking about a huge number of people that would not possibly have kept quiet. There have been no deathbed confessions. There have just been anybody who could, I could make $1 million going on. I could go on Oprah for $1 million and say the moon landings are fake.
Okay,
nobody's done that.
I would say that this is, to me, the most compelling argument is, how do you shut all those people up? And what bothers you about that argument, Joe?
It is a pretty compelling argument. You have that many people, especially knowledgeable people. I mean, I don't know how they would either have to be so close to the data that they were part of that conspiracy, or the government's trying to trick all those experts too at the same time. And it just doesn't add up if you think about that many people involved, especially really knowledgeable people that close to all the things that you're doing.
Yeah, and also people in hostile nations who were watching very carefully to see what would happen. They're also very motivated to find out whether this is fake or not. So I think Phil's doing a really good job to bring up the big picture. That's a really effective way of sense-checking this whole thing. Let's not worry about the tiny, tiny, tiny little details and asking questions about how much of a Nazi von Braun is. Let's look at what the big picture really means. This is a compelling argument, and so it's going to need a compelling rebuttal for Joe Rogan to not believe it anymore if we're talking about a totally even conversation. Joe's going to have something really compelling in order for us to not be persuaded by this argument, surely.
Well, it is a very compelling argument. What bothers me about it is that I know that in government and especially in something as huge as NASA, things are very compartmentalized. You're not privy to all the information about the entire project that you're working on. You are given information on a need-to-know basis. If it's your job to design O-rings, you are designing O-rings. You don't get the data and the blueprints for the entire Saturn V rocket setup. You don't get all that information. The very people at the very top of the food chain knew about it. And isn't it a little odd that a couple days before Apollo 11 launched, the head of NASA resigned? Don't you find that a little odd?
Not necessarily.
That's crazy. This guy's been working on this his whole life. This is a monumental technological achievement. They're about to put a person on another planet. And this guy says, I quit. I don't want to do it anymore.
Was that James Webb?
Why do you think he would quit?
I don't know. Why do you think
Maybe because he doesn't want to be a part of a hoax.
So, yeah, Joe saying that is a very compelling argument. Ooh, look, a squirrel. Look over there. What's that?
It's 100%
he just doesn't answer it. He just distracts to something else.
Yeah, and Joe immediately starts with, well, I know how things are done, and no, you don't know how things are done at NASA. You don't know anything about how things are done at NASA. The way he immediately starts it with, here's a premise that I can easily gloss over. If this was a point by point, it might be a point for you to jump in and be like, you don't know what you're talking about. You don't have any idea how things are done there.
Yeah, exactly. And his argument is just, well, actually, very few people needed to know about it because everybody just does their own small thing, and very few people at the top would need to know the whole picture. Most people would need to know the whole picture, which is just him listening to what Phil Plait said, which is there's loads of experts, and they would know for a fact whether this was possible or not for every little bit that they're doing. Joe listens to that and basically says, "Nuh-uh."
Yep.
And that's it. That's basically all he's doing. But then he distracts onto this other thing as well. Now, if this wasn't an asymmetric conversation, when he starts talking about James Webb, Phil Plait would be like, no. Let's not move on. Let's stay on this one. You think that's enough? But he's not going to do that, because to do that, he would start to look like he's the bad guy in this conversation. So he doesn't get to be as aggressive and dismissive as Joe is being, because then he's just the scientist who's dismissing everything. As for the point about why James Webb quit, he was a Democrat. He was closely tied to Johnson. And since Johnson chose not to run for re-election, he decided to step down so that the new president could bring someone else in. They were pretty much there. They had everything kind of lined up. He didn't have to do anything further. So he stepped down in 1968. And that's why he did that. He wanted the new administration to have a clean sweep of bringing in their own people. That's the reasoning.
Yeah, there's a million reasons to quit your job. Most of them are not conspiracy-based. I think most reasons to leave your job are not conspiracy-based. And this is anomaly hunting that he's doing here to try to point out why would he do this? That's an anomaly. Doesn't that feel anomalous to you? Doesn't that feel weird? Don't you feel weird about that, Phil? And that's what he's using. And here's the thing I would say. And I wrote this note, and we're going to listen to another clip here, and I may take this back, but I will say I wrote this note that says, even if Phil knows the answer as to why James Webb would quit, I would bet anything he would dismiss it. So let's listen to this last clip here in our toolbox section to see where this conversation heads.
I do want to get back to James Webb here for a second. James Webb was the head of NASA. He was the NASA administrator, like the way Mike Griffin is now. Now, he did not resign days before Apollo 11.
When did
he actually resigned? I looked it up in September of 1968. So it was almost an entire year before Apollo 11. Now, this was right before.
Is that true? Because I read online that he resigned days before.
Well, yeah, it depends on where you read. You could read conspiracy sites. You can read stuff that's based in reality. So you got to do that too.
Well, no. I have gone way out of my way to read only pro-NASA sites so that I didn't get any BS.
Well, let's see here. James Webb, NASA retired. And I should spell NASA right, because if I spell it in Bassa, I'm probably going to get something weird. JWST.nasa.gov says Webb retired just a few months before the moon landing.
That's what I'm talking about.
James Webb retired from NASA on October 7th, 1968. That's the National Air and Space Museum website. So it was about a year before Apollo 11. And the reason is because he was a Democratic appointee from, I guess, Lyndon Johnson. It might have been Kennedy. And it was looking overwhelmingly like in 68 Nixon was going to get elected. And it is very common in these situations for the heads of agencies to submit their resignation in these situations. I thought it was after the election. This was evidently right before it. But
well, that's a possible answer, or it could be that he didn't want to go along with a hoax. That's another possible answer.
Okay, so well done to Phil Plait for going back and actually fact-checking the dates on this in particular. But Joe was saying that James Webb retired a few days. Why did he retire just a couple of days before? But it wasn't that. It was a year before. He even tried to claim when Phil Plait says it was a couple of months before, Joe says, that's what I'm saying. No, you weren't.
No, you wouldn't.
You were saying a couple of days.
Exactly.
You were saying like he was just about to have the moon landing faked and then he left.
Yeah.
That's not the same thing.
Sure.
He even tries to dispute literally factual information. Say, well, where did you get the information about the date of his retirement? Because I've looked elsewhere that comes up with a different date. Like, this is fact. This is a matter of factual record that he's trying to dispute. But notice that he loses no credibility. Penn doesn't come in and say, oh, well, this clearly shows you don't know very much about this in this kind of case.
Right.
That it's almost an entire year, and he characterized that as a couple of days. It loses him almost no credibility. Now imagine if Phil had been out by that much on a fact that he was a point that he was making. Joe would be giving victory laps of the studio at this point and saying that Phil's credibility was shot. Penn would be laughing and pointing out how great Joe is at doing this. He's not doing that when Joe's the one on the receiving end of this kind of like catastrophic fact check. And that shows the asymmetric nature of debating in this kind of context. When you debate people who are wrong about things, you've got to be exactly right, or they'll do a victory lap. They can be wildly wrong and just move on. It'll never affect their credibility.
Yeah, and I did make a prediction a clip ago about whether or not Joe would dismiss this information. Here he equivocates. What he does is he says, maybe that's true, but then maybe this other conspiracy thing is true too. We don't know which one is true, right? So he allows for that information to possibly be true, but then he poisons it by saying, but it could also be this other thing. Also, the thing he says, by the way, just real quick, is super asinine. Why would you work for years on a project that you know is a hoax, only to get to the end and have cold feet for it? Like, you're the head of the hoax. Why would you be like, well, now I don't want to be the head of the hoax anymore. I'm going to leave there. That's such a dumb, stupid argument. It doesn't make any sense at all. But again, all he doesn't have to do anything. He doesn't have to set anything up. He doesn't have to display anything. All he has to do is knock shit down. And Joe does a great job these 2 episodes of knocking shit down.
Let's wrap it up with that. Thank you, sir. Appreciate you very much. You're a beautiful person.
Here we are at the end of these 2 episodes, Marsh. What did you think about this debate between Joe Rogan and Phil Plait?
Well, I think what's particularly useful about it is that Joe, as far as we're aware, no longer believes these things about the moon landing. He's kind of said that in a few places. So Joe, as I mentioned in the middle of the show, would disagree with his positions back then, but it's the same guy. And we've just changed the nouns. We just changed the topic of conversation. But those structures of argument, the way he deals with things that he disagrees with, the way he dismisses the things that he disagrees with, the way he has like contempt and will straw man and find the most ridiculous interpretations of points that would otherwise be disconfirming to his positions, whilst accepting anything that's on his side. All those same structures are still there, and they were there 20 years ago. Yeah. So I think what's really instructive about this is Joe Rogan is, in some ways, the same guy. His brain still works in some ways the same way that it did then. What we've seen is the types of conversations that he's having and the types of topics he's turning, that propensity for finding conspiracy theory and finding anomaly and being bombastic in the face of facts that prove him wrong. He's taken that propensity and now he's changed it. He's turning it on topics like the war in Ukraine, like climate change, like HIV, like COVID, and like immigration.
Yeah, for sure. So I didn't have a lot of background with Phil Plait before I listened to this. I didn't know. I'd heard his name before, and I think I had read some tweets of his before, but I had never really listened to him speak. And I was really won over by him. I thought he did an excellent job here of this particular debate. I think Penn praises Joe throughout the entire thing about how he was humble, but I actually think Phil comes off as very humble in this and reasoned, and he never raises his voice, never throws jabs. He tries to answer all the questions to the best of his ability. And I don't think he lost this. Obviously I'm very biased in this. I don't think he lost this, but I don't think he also understood the win conditions. And I think the win conditions were charm Penn Jillette. That was the win condition for this particular argument. It wasn't be right. It wasn't win the argument against Joe. It was out-charm Joe for Penn. And I don't think that he could have done that. And I think we'll find out more out about that in our gloves off. We'll see that's something that was a hill he wasn't going to be able to climb.
Yeah, I think that's fair. I will say that I think the win condition changed at halftime. Like they did the first show, and I think Phil did a better job on that and came across very clearly. And I don't think he, quite understandably, realized going into the second one that the game had changed because he wasn't informed that the game had changed. I think that Joe knew the game had changed, and I would argue possibly even that Penn Jillette was aware that Joe was going to handle this one differently.
Yeah.
And I think Phil was kept in the dark a little bit about that. So yeah, I think he lost the second leg of the tie, but that's because he didn't know it was a two-legged tie.
All right, that's it for this week. Remember that you can access more than a half hour of bonus content every single week for as little as $1 an episode by subscribing at patreon.com/No Rogan. You get ad-free episodes too. Meanwhile, you can hear more from me, Cognitive Dissonance, Citation Needed. You can hear more from Marsh at Skeptics with a K in the Skeptic Podcast. And we're going to be back next week for a little more The No Rogan Experience. If you love the show, please rate and share it. If you want to get in touch with us, become a patron, or check out the show notes, go to NoRogan.com. KNOWROGAN.com.